Well, this is going to be a disjointed hodgepodge of topics that I'm going to be talking about anyway, so I might as well just get into it. So I've been working on translating Metatype into the MBTI four sides model, and which I can't confirm if I've got the right formulation of translation, um, because I have not tested it against other types other than my own type, and it seems to work with my type. Um, but I am somewhat reinventing the wheel because I remember going through this exact same exercise essentially before, although I realize it's going to be a lot harder for people to acclimatize to these formulations that I have derived in terms of my 17 MBTI types, as it were, because there are so many functions which are the same, which are not the same. So, like, there are two different variations of introverted sensing, there are two different variations of extroverted feeling. Actually, there are three. Um, but anyway, so that aside, it will have, like, I actually, that should be my next thing. I should try and work out a specified, because I mean I've already worked out my own definitions of cognitive functions, which I did a long time ago, but I never. Well, I do have descriptions and some definitions, but they're not. They probably need to be elaborated more. Uh, anyway, so my model of the four sides of the mind actually is a much more coherent, holistic kind of thing, and uh, I guess I shouldn't be puffing it up too much because I'm not sure if this formulation is going to be the final one, but because I haven't sort of, I need to find at least one other type, obviously probably at least four types, and identify them and see how it lines up and see how the interpretation works. But the structure itself, uh, yeah, it seems to be very comprehensive and elaborate in terms of also generating I mean, because in my descriptions of the four sides of the mind, which is what I was doing to just interpret MBTI, that is in a sense laid out much more meticulously. So I've got this sort of ontological flow of what happens first, and I derive them from my deep theory of mind. So the whole thing lines up so much better than MBTI does. But there are some things that if people looked at my current formulation, they would be very disorientated from what they're used to. So I just thought that maybe I'd explain some of those fundamental differences and note how they're not that problematic. But basically, there is a lot of convention. There's been a lot of convention baked into MBTI four sides of the mind, just because of how, what I'm going to call approximations, because they're four sides of the mind. I mean, look, if I'm right and they're wrong, uh, then I can say that they are approximations, because they're not incredibly bad, but they're not great either. Um, and this really brings back memories, because I remember saying, yeah, some of these types, they just don't line up well at all. You have to reinterpret the function so broadly to kind of make it umbrella fit into the umbrella of that sort of cognitive behavior that you're seeing operating. Let me just think what else I should say. So I know I went into a whole rambling thing about how some people that have simple circuits effectively don't have a subconscious. This formulation like I'm going to you see, like, because like I'm basically going to say that's true and it's not true. So basically, because these types are corresponding to metatype and not to metagram, it doesn't actually have the sensitivity of saying which of these MBTI types are simple circuits and which are double circuits. There's no uh, you can't read it from the metatype. In a sense, you could. That's how the various metatypes are even constructed. The various metatypes coalesce by the mere fact that there are archetypal emotional tones, because the 24 emotional tones, which are all these things are so complex, I imagine it's so hard to follow, because I'm sort of talking about them back and forth so quickly. But metagram has 24 emotional tones, but each specific false ego is only, sometimes they're only comprised of 5 emotional tones, or some are comprised of 6, I think, if memory serves me correct. But usually they never have all 8 of the potential emotional tones. Each specific type can actually only internally be constructed from a set of emotional tones, which does not include the full set of 24. It only includes a subset of 8. So there are 3 subsets. And between those 3 subsets, they each have like a reflection of each other. So those 8 within them are not all equal. They actually have a unique sort of standing relative to the other ones. It's almost like a kind of chiral molecule that fits into certain properties that it can sort of impinge on the other ones. So you've got these puzzle pieces which are quite unique, and those interrelatedness between those puzzle pieces are uniform between those 3 sets, those 3 subsets of 8. So because therefore certain types are constructed from emotional tones that I was tracking when I was constructing typing people empirically, saying that person has got that emotional tone in their unconscious, and that person has that emotional tone in their subconscious, and that person is expressing that emotional tone in their ego, and these attitudes, these cognitive attitudes are very specifically in what could almost be called an emotional argument. They have a circuitry of emotional argument within themselves. So that circuitry of emotional argument is made up of these emotional tones, which then can be uniformly said to have a certain meta pattern, because the one emotional tone is in some sense the equivalent of the other emotional tone in the other set of 8. So that is how metatype is constructed, is that it knows that there are specific metagram types that all conform to that same meta pattern. And so in some sense, now this is going to seem very strange, is that, so they might be using different emotional tones, which is actually means that they're each of those specific inflections of cognition are different, but in terms of how they are interrelating within their own emotional argument, within their own internal structure, it has the same meta pattern. And so in terms of in terms of how MBTI is defined, it says these people are processing information in the same way, even though they're not using the same cognitive attitude to accomplish it. Okay, so that's the thing that's happening there. Okay, so when you actually then have a, let's say, my rendering of these four sides of the mind, my translation of the MBTI types, four sides of the mind, into my system, which is no longer an approximation, it's very precise, it's actually tracking what is actually happening definitionally. What was my point going to be? So I was just going to say that actually, in some sense, it could be argued that it's closer to socionics, but then Four Sides of the Mind was always a kind of like attempt to update itself up to the sophistication that Model A offered socionics. But anyway, and in some sense, I do think the Four Sides of the Mind does have that kind of edge to it. It does have that. I mean, that's what really gives it its extra purchase. In that people are trying to fathom some kind of the internal integrity between the sides of the mind. What is the story, essentially, of those interlocking features and how do they interrelate? Okay, what else do I want to say here? So, let me get onto this. So yeah, at least my rendering of this Four Sides of the Mind is probably, in a sense, I also, when I tried to render some summary interpretations of my metagram type, which was, I wouldn't say this was an attempt to bridge it towards metatype, but I knew that I was trying to create some kind of interpretive formula to render some kind of boiled down, summarized, kind of characteristics of a type that could, because I mean, my types, when I draw up a metagram type, it looks elaborate as fuck. You don't know what it's like a whole fucking profile. It's a whole psychological, and it's so detailed and elaborate that it doesn't quite, it doesn't give you an obvious point of reference that you can say, oh yeah, that's obviously describing something that I can see in the behavior or something like that. So I distilled it in some measure at some point. I made like these little summaries that basically said, well, in some sense you can divide everyone up into, like, let's say, almost three categories in some sense in terms of their cognition. And these three components were different depending on which set you were dealing with. I'm not going to explain that. And then those three components were rendered in two separate functions. And the one was basically like the teleos function, and the other one was what I called the work function. So the actual thing that did the work, and what that function was trying to essentially the outlook. So I called also I called the teleos function also the outlook function, and I called the work function also the express function, in the sense that it was the thing that was actually immediately being deployed and expressed and utilized in some sense. Anyway, I'm saying all of this. So when I say things like that particular reduction will not be represented in the metatype, although it would probably have some abstract correlation in that, well, if you look at that conglomeration of configured outlooks and expressly used functions, in that summarized reduction, that it will somewhat generate a similar kind of characteristic. So what's most important about the four sides of the mind is that it's somewhat a holistic framing, so it doesn't make sense unless you see the entire constellation at work and how they are impinging on each other, how they are dividing a workload or something like that. So the four sides of the mind only actually even make sense in the context of having a kind of an epistemological accounting of it and an ontological sort of a sensitivity, and then also then with recourse to working out what stage of the psyche or persona or the particular instantiated personality style, like what is it sort of in the midst of, what is it grappling with. Okay, so now I'm just going to describe the basic features as I see it. Okay, so what I'm about to say, I think it won't be that useful for people that are dealing with four sides of the mind, because its components are just too approximate and they're functionally inaccurate to the point at which it doesn't, like the story might not clearly fit, because the functions that are furnished in those slots are just there because they have to be there because of the symmetry of how the whole system works. And I also want to make comments after I go over some of these features. Hopefully I'll remind myself to get back to this topic, as to, it isn't. I thought of this phrase, how, like a very old person might try to teach a very young person, sort of give them some sage advice, like, people are not the same, people don't think the same, everyone's different, everyone's unique, like everyone has their own sort of perspective, and some people are very different from other people, and and the idea that, like, people are missing features that other people, like, they don't have the same set of capacities, they don't have the same sort of so I just want to emphasize that there is effectively an extreme amount of variety, where it's not like, well, some people think in these sorts of ways, and therefore other people might have comparable ways to think in similarly sophisticated, like, even on the level of metatype, it almost tells a unique story, but structurally the challenges are fundamentally the same, in terms of what I can only describe as the deep pathology that is built into the structure of what I can only call the false ego. The four sides of the mind is just the structure of the false ego, in my general understanding of psychology. And I have also come up with some better ideas as to a therapeutic intervention, and I also should get into that. Okay, so let me get on to okay, and perhaps I should, before I just get into the order of the elements within the four sides of the mind model, or at least, I guess we could still call it my interpretation of the four sides model, though I was both integral in Model A and in the four sides, but anyway, I have no direct evidence of that. It will be interesting to see. if people specifically at some point ever countermand my claims. Anyway, what should I say? Okay. Yeah, I think I explained this already, but I'm just gonna do it again very quickly. So, yeah, I guess I won't. I did, I think, already make a recording that involves this, so I'm just going to very quickly skim over it. So, in the structure of the 17 dimensions of psychological reality, they are built one on top of the other, and you can almost envisage a pyramid on top of this, with dimension 1 at the bottom and dimension 17 at being the capstone, being the pinnacle, and where it begins and where it ends is actually part of my therapeutic theory that I have about therapeutic intervention, because you are capable, I think, of imposing artificially almost a partition wherever you so wish, of where the new one begins and the old one ends, because it's I don't know. There are some esoteric people that are sort of into this, like how pyramids rebirth their energy in some sense, that they it travels up into the point, and then somehow the point at the top is connected to the center core of the very bottom of the base, and that these things are like intrinsically somewhat which can also be seen in some geometrical things, that the very pinnacle of the point that reaches is somewhat it's at the core of the it's right in the middle of the broadest so as that point gets ever finer into being, it sort of melds into the widest area in terms of its I can't think of a good enough analogous kind of poetical sort of thing, that as the point points into nothing, that nothing is somewhat the implication of the broadness of everything that is contained within the holistic structure. So the point implies the entirety in some sense, the point at the pinnacle, at the top, and it therefore also implies the kind of the central point, to use the word point as in like point of the issue, the actual object. So the point at the pinnacle grounds the importance in inverted commas, the central object that is part of the first dimension kind of perspective. Anyway, there are much better ways of describing that kind of stuff, but so and that's how the thing kind of restarts from nothing. It transfers from the one into the other. It kind of is reborn within itself, within its own perspective. That the pinnacle rejuvenates the baser perspective, the kind of the broad perspective. It grounds you in the broad, basic interpretation. Or the basis, the most basic framework which you can have is grounded by, in the most particular sense, that pinnacle point. Now, that you can superimpose at any point, because it is like that, because the pinnacle does imply the thing. You can therefore also move that pinnacle you can sort of because you don't change the order, you just sort of uh, you're just kind of promoting a sort of emphasis, and this can all be done in essence virtually, and the reason to do this would be to be able to dislocate the conjoined malfunction that is occurring between the first pairing of the which is somewhat like the evil seed which the false ego coalesces upon. And so that evil seed starts off in the superego, and it's specifically the cognitive pairs of the of what would otherwise be called the nemesis function and the I can't actually call it like this because it isn't actually the same as the nemesis function. Okay, so just in terms of the superego, it is the inferior function, which traditionally and conventionally was linked with being the same as the nemesis function. And the parent function of that inferior function. And functionally, so the reason why I am saying that is the first thing that happens is that effectively what's happening is that the inferior function, okay, so this is my general theory, and I mean, this is not a theory, this is by definition. So this is just to make sense of the four sides of the mind, to make it do some work, that the basic understanding of each side of the mind is that you understand that the inferior function is being consumed by the parent function, and the summary of that consumption is sort of being stored as the hero function in that side of the mind. And the hero function is sort of being anchored by the child function. So that it's sort of so that summary of what the parent is sort of consuming is and so in some sense the child function is also being elicited to help with creating the motivational aversion to the inferior function. So the hero function is sort of is doing the work of summarizing what the parent function is doing in terms of itself, and it sort of has its the account of it doing that function is being traced in a kind of motivational kind of syntax that is in the form of the child function. And I might have to update this with all the other things that I've said, because there might be, I don't know if yeah, so each side of the mind is also unique though, so that doesn't, so what I just said probably kind of goes out of the window, because, and you're going to see what I'm saying now, and so I guess this becomes such an elaborate story that it starts to lose its purchase, because the beauty of the four sides of the mind was its simplicity in it, just everything is a kind of reflection of the other side of the mind. It's either an inversion of it, or it's it's some kind of it's a that like top to bottom, it's an inversion between extroverted and introverted, and left to right, it's the inversion in terms of the ordering of that side of the mind. Now, there is those basic principles have a different expression in my interpretation of these things, because basically, and there's also more to why that natural, not that natural, but that why those rules were good approximations, were good enough approximations, because of how these four sides of the mind end up being furnished. Okay, so you start with, okay, I didn't say where the pair came from. So with these dimensions of psychological reality, each one metaphysically, from an epistemological level, can actually be said to live inside the other one. So just as like a pyramid, the second step of the pyramid is slightly narrower than the base of the pyramid. That's how it ends up becoming a triangle. The higher you go, the less area it has, but the more particular and specific the vantage is offered because of the elevated, and it's only allowed to be elevated because of the mass, the broader mass that is sort of circumscribed below it, that's left out of the picture. So it's like focusing in, right? So what's actually happening is that the from an epistemological level, everything is happening inside the first dimension. So it's like a Venn diagram with just one circle, with 17 circles, all symmetrically inside each other in some sense. And then essentially that, so how, then the question is, how does the false ego even come to be, basically? And I'll tell you how. It's that there is a sort of like an unholy alliance of interaction between these dimensions of psychological reality, but they're not immediate subsequent dimensions of psychological reality. They skip one. And so there's a kind of like, because the ones that naturally touch each other are like, they're too close to be in an obvious kind of malfunctioning pathological condition. So they kind of like, there's some structure that is sort of erected in one of the dimensions, and then it tries to encourage a reaction that reciprocates that structure on not the immediately subsequent dimension, but the one just beyond that. So in 2 dimensions away. So it's kind of like, and so and then also what's happening is that essentially that structure therefore is a form of passivity. So in some sense, what it's actually saying is that actually, wouldn't it be cool if we had an overactive subsequent dimension that could inhabit the space that I'm going to make for it? So I'm going to clear some space. I'm going to not do something. I'm going to be passive so that that void can be filled by the activity of a subsequent dimension of psychological reality. And that wouldn't be the immediate subsequent, it would be the one after that. And so when that one after that is actually filling that void, it's piercing the in-between dimension of psychological psychological or cognitive perspective, or whatever. So you've got this kind of unholy alliance between these two dimensions, which are then having a secondary reactive sort of the best way would be to call it a sympathy. You have a sympathetic reaction, therefore. And then the sympathetic reaction, if it's going to have a stable way of coping with the initial unholy alliance, then it's going to have to sympathetically produce a similar kind of inversion, or a kind of a machine or a device that at least symmetrically kind of records the unsettling sort of disequilibrium, I guess, is another way to put it, but disequilibrium in terms of the dysfunction that is being impinged on this bypassing, no, that's not the right word, but in terms of this collateral damage. Okay, so the first collateral damage is basically the subconscious mind. Okay, so the first thing is the inferior and the parent function in the superego. That is the first activity that is occurring, and effectively the start of the false ego is that one function of psychological reality, which call it the prime first, the first function, is being fed into a dimension of psychological reality that's exactly two above it. So in the case, I'm a Metatype 13, so that means that and don't think about this too much because this is just by convention, but that means that my prime, I could even call it death, the death of my freedom or whatever, is occurring on the level of the fifth dimension of psychological reality, and that passivity of that fifth dimension of psychological reality, which is extroverted intuition, is being fed into the seventh dimension of psychological reality, which is also known as the blood, which is a type of extroverted feeling. So my extroverted intuition is being passive, and my extroverted feeling is somewhat consuming that space within extroverted intuition. It's using extroverted intuition as a facility for itself. Then, to counteract that, because it's bypassed dimension 6, therefore dimension 6, and I might actually be wrong about this, I might have to invert this, but I believe that dimension 6 is therefore forced into being traumatized in some sense. It's forced into allowing that thing to happen. So I believe dimension 6 is not actually the reactive component. I believe that it is being sympathetically bullied, and because it's being sympathetically bullied and being forced into a constricted attitude in some sense, then dimension 8 is effectively unbridled in that sense, and therefore dimension 8 is something like the archetypal lust. I would interpret it that way, perhaps, unless the extroverted feeling of dimension 7 is the lust, and the dimension 5 is the death and the lust. But anyway, this might not be the best level, because because these things are already on a level of abstraction. Metatype is already on a level of abstraction. I would probably think it's safer to keep calling things the death and the lust and the vanity and the enticed lust, to metagram, which I'm not going, which yeah, but anyway, but it's interesting because yeah, I still haven't fully worked out how I'm going to marry even this model of Metatype with Metagram, because they seem to be fundamentally, they're describing things, but they're not describing them on the same level, and so they might be like fundamentally incommensurate. And I'm not sure which one actually holds the key to more therapeutic intervention. I've always considered Metatype to be the actual source of the cure, whereas Metagram really is I only developed Metagram to prove that I could define the problem in its elaborate detail, in which no one could say that I didn't have the answer to psychology. So I used Metagram effectively to create such a specific description of psychological behavior that my model could not be argued with, because but obviously it doesn't really help unless you publish, and I have to get all my ducks in a row as well, because all I really have is the research and a lot of writing, and I have actually forgotten probably some of the some of the steps that I did in terms of proving it, but or in terms of the process, and the whole thing was empirically gathered after the deep theory of mind. Yeah, when I'm talking about proving it, I mean, how do you go about philosophically proving a deep theory of mind? How do you go about vindicating a model? I mean, I'd hoped that Metagram had some way that it could be at least what's the word? That Metagram would have some ability to get into psychometry, but it's so elaborate to try. I mean, I remember helping some people work on some psychometric things, but I'm not very good by myself. I really need a committee to sit in on and be a sort of participant and interlocutor. I mean, that's how. So, I mean, I guess when I say that, well, I think I did say it correctly. Did I not say that I helped develop these things? I don't really have the interest of being a sort of, my expertise has been so specialized that it's, if I have to care about the details of what some kind of stupid consensus is being baked up in academia, although, I mean, psychology has always been a shit show. Okay, let me just get back to what I was saying. So after the first pair, the subconscious sort of sympathetically generates its corresponding parent and inferior. And so the subconscious, I think, is sort of being bound in a kind of trauma relationship in relation to the superego, that the subconscious is almost fundamentally antithetical to the superego, and that's probably a revision on some of the things that I said before, although this model might be open to revision. Okay, then I'm not sure what actually happens next. I'm not sure if as soon as the subconscious has developed, because that pair in the subconscious basically becomes also, in its inverted form, it becomes the parent and the inferior of the ego. So the subconscious parent and inferior get swapped in the ego slot of inferior and parent. Okay, but I don't know if that happens yet. I think that actually only happens after the ego gets its hero and child. I think the hero and child is the thing that is taking from the subconscious its primordial engine, which is that machine, that machine that is like sympathetically rooted to the superego. So it is the remnant of the ego, it is the remnant of the resistance to the superego. So the subconscious is somewhat the resistance against the superego at the closest sort of ontological ordering of events. And so if the ego wants to actually be in charge, it actually has to it has to find a way to leverage those sympathetic elements. Okay, because sorry, when I said that the ego's use of them becomes the resistance to the superego, is what I should rather say. Because the subconscious is more in a kind of strange, perhaps codependency with the superego. Okay, a lot of this should be taken with a pinch of salt and tentative, but let me just get all the moving parts on the field, and then, some revision will probably come. Maybe I'll have some discussion with someone which will help, get some better ideas. Okay, then the next thing that happens is the unconscious gets... now so I said that I didn't know if the ego has already kind of begun from its parent function. So, I mean, either the ego is being driven from its parent function in order to kind of make the ego the prominent, dominant side of the mind and start making the superego sort of contained. And I think the ego, in a sense, is always trying to sort of contain the superego so that it can freely access the resources of the unconscious mind, because the unconscious mind is actually fundamentally distinct. And the reason why it's distinct is because it is the synthesis, somewhat, of those two prior elements. So I don't know if I should be talking about this in terms of the ego at all, because I don't think the ego has actually emerged yet, because the ego has not actually gotten its hero and child function, which I believe might be the thing that's actually repurposing elements of the subconscious to resist the superego and to dominate, in that act, dominate two things, dominate both the subconscious and the superego, by disrupting the perspective of the subconscious, by, flipping it on its head, and by, therefore, at the same time, kind of it's weird, because I guess in terms of it doing that, it could either be seen to be kind of sort of in some what's the word, in some tacit sense, it could be even sort of agreeing with the superego and therefore gaining power that way, or it could be in terms of how it's reversing the subconscious. So it's weird, because I think that the subconscious, parent and inferior, it is in some kind of sympathetic correspondence with the superego's parent and inferior. And so, yeah, whatever the ego is doing with it, it's sort of poking the superego in some sense, you know. So it's perhaps not only, it's forcing the superego to develop new things, to do new works in some sense, but all that work is going to be somewhat hidden. It's going to be and it's only going to be able to be expressed via the subconscious. Okay. Anyway. And therefore, the ego might be fighting the superego via the medium of the subconscious's kind of sensitivity, which that sensitivity is the sympathy, is the fundamental sympathy that it has to what the superego is doing. So the ego is somewhat using the subconscious to sort of do some kind of, perhaps dominate the superego, or perhaps somewhat do some kind of dealing with it. You know, it might not be might not be fixed into a particular antagonism. It might be you could have perhaps a choice of internal style, which would have knock-on consequences on other relations between the sides of the mind. Okay, so none of that has happened yet. The ego, I don't think, is active, actually. Although, again, this might be different in individual case by case. It might all, some things might trigger things in some person's actual experience. At you know, some things might be almost precocious. They might almost be sort of, you know, like, it doesn't often happen, but maybe someone actually does develop an ego in terms of that their parent function was the first thing that sort of awakened, because the subconscious just immediately was disrupted, or I mean, basically someone developed a subconscious in sympathy to the superego, and then they immediately inverted because they just wanted to be self-eviscerating in some sense, and so they actually kind of ignited their ego spontaneously before it had a fucking hero and child, you know. And that itself might, you know, precipitate its own sort of style of a particular sort of subspecies of false ego development, you know, that could perhaps relate to you know, just because they were introspectively explorative and curious, and they were aware of these things as they were sort of appearing within the mind, as they were being generated, and they just, you know, decided to play around with them, even though that they were uncomfortable, and so they kind of developed a kind of ad hoc, you know. So I think that there's an array of possibility here, that it's not set in stone. But okay, apart from those issues, I'm just going to move on finally. So the thing that actually happens next, for certain, is the unconscious. Now, therefore, the unconscious is going to be in some kind of independent. When the unconscious pairing is generated, this is the first hero function. So the unconscious child and hero is the first of its kind. So this is the first time that you actually have a hero function and a child function is in the unconscious mind. And it does this in some sense in order to kind of adjudicate over the things that have just happened. And so it's kind of like a command center. It's kind of like a power broker in some sense. And so whatever has gone on before, it's going to somewhat try to regulate and compensate for, or something like that. So it already is kind of founded on top of whatever complexity has occurred, is going to be somewhat what is taken into its purview in terms of the establishment of this hero function and child function. And it's almost the only center of what I want to call positive unbridled value. Everything before then is somewhat in a conditioned reactive state. The unconscious elements here are actually somewhat, they're trying to, in essence, it is almost the source of responsibility for what has happened before. So it's the point at which there is a kind of internalized consideration that is being structured into, which is, so at the same time that it's dealing with what's going on, it also therefore internalizes what's going on. So it gets a picture, its own internal picture of the structure of, so within this child and this hero, there's a positive spin, there's a positive perspective on, and when I say positive, I just mean that in the most technical and strictest sense, that it's trying to create a somewhat a knowledge value based system on more in the form of belief. So that's what I mean by positive. Is that I mean that it is a postulated proactive framework of how things work. I need to blow my nose. I'm still recovering from the flu. Okay, so the next thing that happens, because now the same thing happens again, is that because that is happening on the level of because effectively what the child function is doing is it's trying to lend in a motivational sense, in a positive sense, it's trying to value. It's easier to describe it the other way. You could say that like. This is. I might have to think about this. This might be too complex for me to actually come up with a decent description of it, because I don't think the things that I've said before are going to quite apply as they should to what I've just described. Let me just try to guess something that kind of sounds good then. So, what do I think is happening at this point? You see, the problem is that it's hard for me to speak about this at this point, because this is already going to be, I don't know what to say about it at this point, because it gets so much more complicated. These two functions the unconscious mind is the biggest crossroads in the entire four sides of the mind. The unconscious mind is the biggest battleground, because there's a threefold bind that there's a two-way battleground that it hasn't happened yet, but when the superego gets its child and parent function, then the inverse of that becomes the unconscious mind's parent and inferior. And when that happens, because the unconscious mind just, I think actually that's actually how I should describe the hero and the child of the unconscious mind, is that the hero and the child, both of them are pretty much they're trying to be homeostatically happy with each other and stable. They don't see that, it's like they're just trying to confer validation onto one another, but they end up being forced apart, or not, they don't necessarily end up being forced apart, but that homeostatic positive kind of recapitulation of how it's trying to kind of hold some kind of stability and value and positive belief, it comes under these tremendous reactive sympathetic forces. It gets, and primarily this is, okay, so let me say this, is that the hero function basically is in some kind of problem because it has to try to fuck over the superego. It has to try and fight the superego to hold its dominance. And it can only do that by making the hero function and the superego the inferior function of the unconscious mind. So it has to find a way to use the child function of the superego. It has to somehow make it the parent in the unconscious in order to facilitate the consumption of the superego's hero function. And that's what the hero of the unconscious needs in order to have a functioning parent and to not be sort of and to keep its belief structure pristine and somewhat because it's just trying to be apart from the superego's kind of reactive warring. The superego is really like a beast, whereas the unconscious is really just trying to be like an open book. That's all it really wants to be, is just wants to have a kind of an open cartography. It's trying to just understand, not understand, it's trying to know it just wants to have some kind of scale and metric so that it can just record things and that it's got all of its ducks in a row and it's all nice or whatever. But to do that, it has to keep the beast at bay. And so it has to invalidate the superego's, kind of combative antagonism and its kind of and so this all of these explanations probably need to be neatened up. And so the hero function has to facilitate this, and the hero function of the unconscious mind has to facilitate this. It has to facilitate elevating the superego's child function as the unconscious's parent function, so that it can subjugate effectively and consume and to try and pin down. Because if you don't pin down the superego's hero function, it's just going to run away. It's just going to go and do something else. And you're not going to be able to have a kind of a metric in the open book. You're not going to be able to you're not going to have stable knowledge until you find something that kind of constrains the animal of the superego, the beast of the superego, which has this unstable conditioning. It presupposes conditioning, and it has all these reactive, circuits that's connected with everything else, like booby traps. Anyway, I'm talking about things that haven't actually happened yet, but anyway, this will happen. So let me just talk about it. And so, what actually has to happen is the hero function of the unconscious has to facilitate this, but then it also has to not lose its good standing or its, let's say, collaborative, positive resonance of values, of stable values that it's co-creating with the child function. So the child function is sort of like, well, what is my hero doing? My hero is doing all these ulterior things, and is he still capable of being commensurate with the initial situation with me, you know. So it's like the hero is sort of divided there, right? And so that is putting a kind of reactive stress onto the unconscious's child function. And that stress effectively is going to be redirected through the hero within the parent function in some sense. And that parent function itself is itself, you know, in a huge amount of stress, because if it doesn't do the requisite amount of dominance over the inferior function, then the superego is let loose, the beast is let loose from the cage. Okay, this hasn't happened yet. So, but anyway, so the unconscious is the first hero and child, and it's just kind of trying to be stable, I think. Then what happens next? And then again, I don't know. Oh no, wait, never mind. I was talking about another mirror. Okay, then the thing that happens next is the ego gets its parent and gets its hero and child. So as soon as the unconscious gets its hero and child, the parent gets its hero and child right afterwards. And because it gets it right after the unconscious got its ones, it is obviously superior because it happened after the fact. And so it gets like the second bite of the cherry. It gets to include what has happened before. Now, then it also only really can properly assert its dominance, its let's say epistemologically privileged position. It can only capitalize on that if it can at least take over another side of the mind. And so and also, so if it can repurpose the subconscious, which is somewhat problematic, because if you invert those primordial elements in the subconscious, right, which all happened before the ego got its thing, which was kind of in a conjoined response with the unconscious mind's hero and parent. So the ego is like another positive manifestation, but it's a kind of like, it's an afterthought, and in some sense it's quite bitter, because the unconscious didn't have any doubt. In some sense, all the ego is doing is it's doubting the unconscious. It's actually, it's like a second revision of the knowledge. It's like, well, you know, some stuff written in that book is actually it's a waste of time. It's not actually useful or helpful. In some technical way, it might be true, but it's not practical. Something like that. You know, so the ego is like naturally it's actually the ego's value that is so the best way to understand it is that the child function in the ego was the function being bypassed by the unconscious's value parade, you know, or you know, so and it was, you know, its parade sort of had to kind of use the in-between dimension of psychological reality, and it turned the ego's child function into a circus, which then basically let the hero function sort of attend that circus and flex its muscles and look, you know, and look very special. And so the hero function with the kind of precipitated ignoring that the unconscious was doing to the ego's child function is therefore the general disposition of the ego, in that it wants to vindicate its child function, which is effectively you see, it's weird because the unconscious is like, it's not that naturally antagonistic, and the unconscious itself is effectively trying to keep order between the superego and the subconscious. It's trying to be a commanding, kind of brain center that just tries to create a kind of stable compromise between those sides of the mind. And effectively, the ego then says, well, I can see that maybe, okay, it doesn't really perhaps say this directly, but it feels these forces, and it basically, in some summarized sense, it says, well, unconscious, there are better ways to do the same job. I'll just do it rather than have to deal with what you're doing to my child function. And so the ego is sort of on a quest to empower itself, therefore, and so it's directly grappling with the subconscious. And so the ego then is basically also complaining against the unconscious, that the unconscious has been bad in its adjudication of trying to find a kind of stability between these forces, that it's actually been biased, basically, relative to the ego's perspective. And in some sense, I don't want to say which one was more on the side of the superego. It's just that I think the unconscious and the ego both have the same complaint for different reasons. Because you see, the unconscious mind is directly trying to disrupt the superego, and the ego is directly trying to disrupt the subconscious mind, which was the sympathetic trauma victim of the superego. So in some indirect sense, the ego is kind of like trying to say that the unconscious mind has been too dabbing and let's say personally, it's been harsher on the superego than it has been on the subconscious. And so effectively, the ego believes that the unconscious mind is too neutral to the subconscious and too antagonistic against the superego, and the ego has just basically the kind of a counteract to just has the has its own priorities in that sense. But because it came, but then the ego also has a fight to pick against the unconscious, effectively, for trampling on its child function. And then okay, so I probably could have gone into that with some more detail, and that probably is worth also looking at that kind of asymmetry as well, and cashing out that asymmetry is probably very important to understanding some features of some psychological behaviors, in terms of people's particular psyches and schemas. And then I'm going to talk about the last thing to happen is well, no, it's actually not the last thing to happen, but the next thing to happen is the child function, and the hero function of the superego then emerges. And it's kind of, it's strange that it's late to the party in some sense, but so it's weird that the ontology of the motivational elements, right, are first the unconscious, then the ego, and then the superego. And in some sense, I think this is effectively because the ego has yeah, let me think. So, I mean, it's weird. So, this I don't actually know exactly how to interpret this, because it really depends on when exactly the inversions occurred, which I'm not entirely sure when they did occur, or if it even is a stable kind of pattern. But I'll say that the you see, like it's kind of, you need to actually start with a new explanation every time, because these pairs it's weird how they kind of shift over, because it's like, you're dealing with pairs of these things that are interlocked, like I don't know, like thatching or whatever. So and so they kind of so there are two pairs, and then like there's a whole new set of another two pairs that are happening because of what has happened before. So anyway, yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to ground myself. So now I'm talking about the last two pairs. But it's so much more complicated, because I think that not knowing when these things get mirrored, like the thing that I'm talking about right now, the thing that I'm trying to talk, the hero and the child of the superego, is immediately mirrored into the unconscious mind, and perhaps even the unconscious mind was already trying to bind, because of just the nature of belief itself and knowledge itself, that there's already a kind of reservoir of implicit restrictions which is going to be applied against the superego's child and hero valuation. So as soon as the superego sort of develops its child and hero, it's in the context of an all-out war against the unconscious mind. So it is born into an antithesis. So even though that these are like, in inverted commas, positive slots, the hero and the child, they're meant to symbolize valuation. these are like in the rift, they are in the midst of existential invalidation from the unconscious's already developed values. And you already have a kind of inversion of values that is being sort of levied against and trying to disrupt by taking those same functions that the superego has as the child and the hero and inverting them in terms of its inferior and parent. So the unconscious's parent and inferior is the inferior of the unconscious is the hero of the superego, and the child is taken as the parent. So in some sense, the superego's child is like more empowered, is more energized, is more charged than the hero is. The hero is like, of the superego, is sort of like well, I guess, traditionally it's called the demon function for a reason, kind of thing. Okay, and then the very last thing that happens is the subconscious gets its hero, and the subconscious gets its hero and child function, and you have to remember that this happens basically as a reactive consequence of the superego. So the subconscious is basically a direct sympathetic. The subconscious is like a reservoir of the superego's malevolence in some sense. So the subconscious is a real passive victim in that sense. And so I would almost call it like the emotional repository. The kind of I've often called it the atmosphere of the dream of living, that it's sort of it is the connotation of things. It's like it's like the grammar of how adjectives are categorized, in terms of their significance and their meaning. That it's sort of it is the tone in which life is sort of viewed. And effectively it's so it's strange as well, because then I would say that its hero function, so it's almost like it is the essence of self-deprecation. This might be my slight bias from my particular type. That is, let me just say that as an INTJ, traditionally, the ESFP humor of the INTJ subconscious is said to have a very particular kind of wit and such. And I will say that there are few types that have as well a translation as INTJ. Some types are just hideously approximated by the MBTI four sides. I don't even know how people can actually. I remember actually arguing when I was talking with these people about, no, it's still good enough, because they said no, but I haven't done the work now. I haven't redone the work, should I say? But I remember when I was discussing this with people, they said, some of these types are just so far off, like from my formula, how far off they are in the MBTI version of roughly the same type. And I said, no, it's actually not that bad, because although I've got FE in that slot, or SI in that slot, or TI in that slot, that TI is actually that particular strain of TI is actually kind of like that other function, so it's like a kind of like a good enough approximation. But anyway, okay, is that everything? Yeah, and that is actually, I'm going to end it there, that's everything. Wait, I was going to talk about therapy, and I was going to talk about something else as well. Yeah, so I think the linchpin really is, and it might not just be enough to do this, you might have to like actually understand and sort of internalize and be familiar enough with your internal psychic, kind of how these things are. You actually have to see it introspectively and believe that this is how your mind, is somewhat operating. And with that consciousness, in terms of being aware of your internal cognition, then what you do is you actually take the that very first one, the inferior function, and the parent function in terms of the superego, and you just basically you stop that pathology. You basically and I think that how this is actually done is that you actually have to take the parent function and you have to start using it in the broader term of the word. You have to start using it responsibly, and you have to dislocate its use from the dimension of psychological reality that corresponds to the inferior function. And I still need to do probably some work to kind of because these things are so detailed in their theoretical description. No, it's not that they're detailed, it's that they are cryptic in their theoretical description, that I don't have very easy definitional things to say, oh, this is how that dimension of psychological reality is actually defined, because I don't define it so much as it has a model of how it is the actual cognition is described, but but you can't just describe it as an object. It's sort of it's so I can't, let me think of an analogy. It's like, there's a difference between singing a song and reading the lyrics of a song. And you have to sing it to know. So the theoretical descriptions that I have is like the actual song itself. It's describing what the song is. It's not, and just breaking it down into lyrics. It's like it's not the same thing. So I don't know how to get people to contact that. That might require like some kind of. I haven't. In some sense, these are just cues. These are things that I've written down on a piece of paper that allow me to locate that form of cognition, that allow me to see that mechanism or that part of thinking, that part of consciousness, that part, that articulated ability within consciousness. So, it's also fucking complicated because it has two different references. It has the reference of the present immediate subjective sense, and it has the reference of the account of the thing, which is like the past. So you have the past reference of that cognition, which is not the same thing as the immediate subjective apprehension. So and then and the past reference is also how we can appreciate other people, or what other people are doing, or how they are doing it. Depending on, the whole thing can semantically collapse. So fucking, it's you have to develop conventions about how to even introduce the subject. Even so, I mean, like, yeah, this is a different discussion. Anyway, I'm just going to stop the video. That's an hour and a half. That's long enough. I'm just going to add a small addendum. So in terms of the symmetry of these pairs, there is some logic in that when I talk about the hero and the child function that becomes part of the superego, because it kind of lines up in terms of the ordering. So if you can think of the very first thing is in the superego, and then the second thing becomes the primordial sort of sympathetic counteraction in some sense, or I guess not really a counteraction at that point. It's only a counteraction when it's mirrored in the ego. But the subconscious is at least in a kind of sympathetic kind of traumatic, sort of interlockedness with those with the pair that makes up the superego, which is the first thing. So the first and the second thing, and then the next thing is the is the first thing of like positive value, which is the unconscious. And so those are already like the first three sort of, those are the three core native constituents. And then the second thing of value, the hero child pairs, attaches to the ego, which then is the kind of, that already is kind of asymmetrical, but and then it's a follow on from the first value thing. And so it's kind of like it's responding to that almost benign sort of value, that thing that just wants to try and be a stable value sort of belief machine in the unconsciousness, and then the ego is just basically like the thing that was trodden on, and so it's like the responding sort of afterthought to that. And then you see, like, because whenever you're talking about two things, one after the other, those are the things that are immediately kind of interlocked between each other. And so after you talk about that ego thing, which then obviously is probably trying to do something to the subconscious functions that it's trying to reposition as its parent and inferior, to gain dominance over the subconscious. The ego is trying to gain dominance over the subconscious, which it sort of naturally, because of its relationship with the unconscious, it's naturally set up to do in some sense, in order to try and almost be the advocate of the subconscious in terms of how the unconscious has sorry, did I say the right thing? So the ego is trying to be almost try to be the advocate of the source of the subconscious, in terms of how the unconscious has been calibrated to sort of take a certain evaluation and reading of the superego and the subconscious, because it occurred in the pause that follows that pairing. So it's like the first reading of what has come before, but according to the ego, it's sort of unbalanced. Okay, yeah, that is a bit sketchy, I guess, how I just kind of went through that element. But the point that I wanted to get to is that the very last pairing, which is the hero and the child of the superego, See, like, a lot of things have happened. Like, the initial things happened, the initial pair happened, and then the positive belief structures happened. And so now the superego's hero and child is like the reading on those positive structures and how those positive structures are interlocked and intersecting each other, and like, sort of like, you know so the this value structure of child and hero in the superego is really just trying to uh, what I'm trying to describe almost in the numerology of this is that it is naturally inclined towards trying to solidify the superego, because it's sort of in league with that, because it's sort of like, it's the if you don't count the things that are the kind of inverse representation of another side of the mind trying to repurpose things from and pillage, like, the resources, and invert those resources from other sides of the mind, it is the fifth thing that occurs after four things have happened before. And I keep on trying to emphasize that these things happened in pairs of that these that there are always two pairs, and then there's like a new recalibrated relationship with the next two pairs, and now this is the start of a new thing, and it's taking stock of all of that stuff that's come before. And it's trying to take a summary view, I guess, in some sense, or it's trying to come to like a sort of a final solid kind of precipitate from the value structures that have come before it, but it can't. The only way to do that effectively is to cut through the arguments, the kind of the intransigence in the value structures, and resonate more with the negative conditioning that was really at the start anyway. So what I'm not making a good job of describing this, but what I'm trying to say is that the reason why this next value structure, I believe, attaches to the superego and tries to sort of consolidate the superego perspective, and why this function will gravitate towards consolidating this side of the mind and being intrinsically part of the side of the mind, is that, like, in the and this really has to do with a kind of, the almost the epistemological pattern that is woven into how these things impinge upon each other. And so, and this can also be seen, I guess I'm going to have to talk about this numerology thing, because now I understand how bad this sounds. I'm not advocating numerology, but I'm saying that there are these abstract patterns in terms of the dimensions of psychological reality. And I actually think that this is why the subject of numerology even applies in some sense, how it got off the ground. It only applies when like, for example, I mean, I don't know specifically about the tarot, but if you have a certain set of archetypal figures and you place them, or you agree that they should, or there's been some kind of idea about how to sequence them, and you can actually start attaching numbers to them, right? That if there's some kind of internal logic or some kind of reason why the sequencing is appropriate, then there are certain abstract properties that you can almost extract from just like taking out certain numbers in that sequence and putting them in certain constellations, that you make very particular abstract recipes, and that really just has to do with like the logic of the sequencing in some sense. And as I said, I think that all of this logic of sequencing comes from like the highest archetype really is would be something like dimensions of psychological reality, right? Would be like the most meta kind of analysis. And so if there is going to be a numerology, it's going to apply to dimensions of psychological reality. And so it's really just an abstract pattern that you can read. And this is going to sound sort of stupid, but yeah, but hopefully I'm deconstructing it now to get to the substance. That when you skip, so when you've got these pairs interlocking with these pairs and things like that, you've got a set of two things followed by another set of two things which occur after that prior set of two things, and then you've got a last set of two things as the sort of as the prime features, and they're in these distinct factions and things like that. So we're talking about the fifth thing that has occurred in pairs of dichotomies, because these two pairs that appear together, they have a kind of antagonism. So it's like these things that are close to each other, like the one is seen as negative and the other one is seen as positive. That's arbitrary how you want to assign the positive and the negative, but however you assign it, it actually works consistently. So you would say, like, if the very first thing is positive and the second thing is a sympathetic negative, or the other way around, if the first thing is negative and the next thing is a kind of sympathetic imprint of that negative thing, and therefore it's a positive sympathetic response or reaction, and then you have another pair that emerges subsequent to that, which is sort of taking that structure as a kind of as a reified condition or substructure that it's built on top of, then it's doing something, and then it's doing the same abstract thing to its corresponding sympathetic, reaction, which all of this has therefore that earlier imprint somewhat inculcated into its functioning, but it's still doing its own functioning at a more specialized level, because this is what's happened when the dimensions of psychological reality are stacked on top of each other or within each other. So in terms of the more delicate, nuanced, sophisticated dimension, the higher dimension of psychological reality is having to do this work within the broader context of this earlier stuff that is happening somewhat in the background, but that is sort of part of the framing. Okay, so I'm basically just trying to say is that as therefore something is happening within something else, which is happening within something else and happening within something else, and there's this consistent pattern of how these things are somewhat impinging upon each other, that then the last set of things is going to almost metaphorically have to reinforce the thing that happened exactly four elements before it. So so it's just because of the sequence. Okay, I haven't made a proper case, but just because of the sequencing, I'm saying is that it is actually reasonable, although I haven't explained it that well, that it's going to echo the the initial thing. So I have this kind of sentiment sort of built into me from all of my work of modeling things. I guess that is because I am superimposing the what I've taken to be the archetypal process of the false ego, which is that you start with a condition, which then creates an unlimited freedom. So the condition would be the death, the freedom would be the lust in this sense. And then that precipitates the next pair, which is the vanity and the enticed lust. And the vanity is the knowledge, somewhat the knowledge in line with the lust, which was the last thing to sort of happen. And so the vanity is almost, it's weird because it actually has to sort of, it has to echo the condition against the lust. So because the lust sort of overrides the condition, because the unlimited freedom, you know, so if you want to call the death the condition, right? Okay, this is a little tiny philosophical, almost, you know, a little rambling or whatever as an example. But if something is a condition, if you take that condition to be a rule, and if you say that, well, this is the rule, if you actually have a solid, rigid rule to depend on, just because of how thought works, you can do anything you want with that rule. There is no way to make a rule impervious to exploitation, basically. So if you know one thing, if you can depend on that rule, then you can use it like an unlimited power. And that's exactly what the lust is. The lust is effectively the idea that, yes, you've accepted the truth of some condition, which therefore your freedom has been completely abjectly dissolved and conditioned by the imprint of that authority. But then you can use that authority against everything else. So by representing that authority, by invoking it, you can therefore do as you will. And so by accepting that authority, it empowers you with that same death force, to qualify it metaphysically. And what the vanity then tries to do is it tries to basically even this out, because the power could also cut itself. That's the main problem of the unlimited quality of the lust, is that it's so powerful that it degrades its own efficacy. This is described poetically in the scriptures as the whore of Babylon, which is effectively the queen of Babylon, but that is her curse, is that she doesn't have integrity, so she's only the whore. So she's the most powerful, and she expects the kings and the rich merchants to offer her anything that she wants and to deliver everything that she wants. But there's one thing that they can't give to her, and that is integrity or honor. So it's somewhat it's a house of cards, Anyway, so it's weird how the vanity is both tilted towards the lust, sort of enabling it, but it's also somewhat trying to inculcate something of the echo of the condition, but to enhance the power of the lust and to kind of bring it some level of coherence. But as soon as that coherence actually starts being promulgated and developed, it's unsustainable itself, but it's unsustainable for a different reason, in that it doesn't actually have any motivational force anymore. That's the problem with the vanity, is that when the vanity is incomplete, you can still imagine that you might be able to get a free lunch. But when you realize, when your knowledge system is being fully rendered, then you end up getting basically this is what Cain, in the Cain and Abel story, the Cain symbolizes the vanity where you work for everything that you make. So you know exactly what you're going to reap already. Abel is actually symbolic of the enticed lust, which is that essentially if you can find a way to be parasitic with life, uh, then you can sort of get life to give you a free lunch, because you might get lucky some year, and all you have to do is protect your herd from predators, and you can just basically benefit from nature doing its own thing. So you kind of so it's a weird kind of husbandry, to use it as a spiritual metaphor. So that's what the enticed lust is trying to do. It's trying to react against the vanity in some sense, because the vanity isn't good enough. The vanity ends up becoming, it's like the condition, but it needs that kind of conditioning needs to be exploited again. So it's the same kind of basic division is happening again, but it's happening on a higher level that has swallowed in the earlier kind of I can't remember the term now. It swallowed the earlier incongruency, and then the next thing is the trial, which is really when the shit kind of hits the fan, and that's the fifth thing that happens. And I do have a feeling that it's trying to be a synthesized meta value system. So the superego here, through its sorry, did I say parent and child? I meant to say hero and child. Through so the fifth thing, I believe, is the superego's hero and child, and it is and I do think that it is constantly operating in some sense. That hero and child is being almost in a meta analysis, in a metaphorical way. It is actually constantly active. I don't see type not actually enacting that. Like, it might not be conscious. Yeah, there's something very strange about the superego in this sense, that I think even the acting out of all the sides of the mind, I think they end up conforming generally to that meta drama. That's how I've described it. So I think that superego, hero, and child is somewhat the almost the summary of whatever power dynamics are happening between the other sides of the mind, and then obviously that is immediately disrupted by the unconscious mind. That is the work of the unconscious mind, is to repress that effectively. Because that hero and that child is immediately turned into the unconscious's inferior and parent function. Which is, and I don't know how to describe the disjointedness of this, because you see what the unconscious mind is trying to disrupt it's trying to do with inverted commas old technology. And what I mean by that is that the unconscious is already being threatened by the ego. It's already being countermanded by the ego. So it's actually the ego that is letting in the havoc from the superego in sort of, so I think there is actually quite an uneasy sort of three-way, um, and it's, I don't even know what to call it, but this conflagration is occurring within the unconscious side of the mind. So the unconscious side of the mind is the crossroads where three sides of the mind are almost, well, through some indirect means, I guess. So that it's not. Um, so it's interesting because the what has also been called the trickster function, the child of the unconscious mind, is in some indirect sense, it's the most tapped into. Um, no, I'm saying the wrong thing. It is tapped into the most things. It is like the most sensitive in a way. It's like one of the most prime levers because it's connected to its hero function. It's allowing its hero function. It has to be permissive of a hero function that is having to indirectly um, deal with the superego, facilitate, the parent, its parent function, which is trying to uh, keep the superego's hero function as the inferior. So the hero of the unconscious has to work with the parent function, um, which was the superego's child function. I shouldn't have said that first though, because it has to do that, but it has to do that after it is uh, after it is see, it's got like an open antenna to the subconscious's first setup, um, in the same way that the vanity that I described in my little story is sort of representing the coherent power of the lust. Is trying to bring coherence and grounding into articulating the subconscious. So the unconscious is the almost the senior driver of the subconscious. It should be regarded as the architect, um, in that it is structuring and underpinning the subconscious domain, even though, um, and I have been in this instance, you can say ontology and epistemology. In this context, at least in this particular instance, they are both pertinent. Uh, Even though the unconscious in this respect is ontologically subsequent to the subconscious. Uh, as I say, all these pairs that I'm talking about is Never mind, I'm just going to start my next video, which is on a completely different topic.